The National Center Graduate Research Fellow, as well as does very important work for immigration rights in New York City. And my name is Rhiannon Mayton. I am an associate professor at State University of New York at Portland, so here in New York State. I am also, for the year, a visiting scholar at the National Center. So thank you so much for coming. So we are talking again about trends in how workers are exerting tactical power within education broadly. And we're very interested today in thinking about across the educational continuum. I don't know if folks in here were at some of the presentations yesterday, but it was interesting that it kept coming up, this need to bridge what's happening in higher education with K-12 and really thinking about education as this continuum or as this process that is connected. And so I think that is part of what brought us together is we have two very exciting and unique data sets that were happening individually. So Melissa, or Mimi, Mimi has been compiling with a team based out of Brown University a database of tracking all strikes in K-12 over the past number of years. And when I came to the National Center, I learned that Jake, as well as Bill and Daniel and others at the National Center, had a similar database tracking strikes in higher ed. So what we're doing here is this is a novel thing in that we're bringing these data sets together and we're thinking about, are there similarities and differences across these different levels of education? What can perhaps one sector learn from the other in terms of identifying these patterns? So that's sort of where we're going today. Now, as we all very likely are aware in this room, we are seeing a rapid increase in strikes. This is happening across sectors. It's not just education, but it certainly includes education, and in many ways, education has been at the forefront of what we are seeing in terms of the labor movement and striking. It is notable that 1/3 of all union members who are in the U.S. are in education. So that's a very significant number. 1/3 of union members are in education. And so what we are seeing is that education is one of the few sectors in the U.S. where labor is still strong. And we are seeing also striking happening across a wide range of locations. So they're happening, as you saw, and you can see in the image, the one on the left-hand side is from Indiana and part of the Rent for Ed strikes that happened in 2018, 2019. And then in the other image, you can see workers from the University of California, Berkeley, striking. So these are sort of emblematic. What we're seeing is education workers striking, and they're striking as a means of influencing educational policy, influencing funding patterns, working conditions, so things like class sizes, health and safety provisions, as well as, of course, their own material conditions. And they're also, as other people have spoken about at this conference so far, seeking to influence common good provisions. So they're thinking also beyond, what's happening, what affects me directly as workers, but also how the social and political environment is shaping students' experiences within the schools. So part of what has brought us together today is this we have noticed that there's a long-standing perception that over the past 40 years, strikes have not been effective, that they've been costly to the public sector, and also concerns, especially in the U.S., that they are breaking the law. So these are sort of ongoing concerns that shape the labor movement and perceptions of strikes. So we know strikes are a desperate measure for workers to take, and yet we are still seeing increases in strikes, and often in contexts where striking is not legal. So we're interested in sort of digging deeper into this. Oh, thanks. K-12 and higher education as a comparison point for this. Well, one thing to note is that around 82% of all U.S. children attend public schools. Also, around 39% of U.S. 18 to 24-year-olds attend college. So this is something that affects a wide population of U.S. citizens. And in addition to that, political issues are common across, whether it's higher education or K-12. We're facing very similar attempts to control what teachers and professors teach, how they teach it. Funding issues are common. Issues of being underpaid amongst workers are common. We also see concerns about class sizes. So all of these extend together. So we are asking today what is going on, what is similar and different across these various contexts. In so doing, we'll be covering a few different areas today. So we will pass shortly to Mimi, who will discuss her data set on K-12 strikes. We'll pass to Daniel and to Jake, who will talk about the data sets on higher education strikes. And then we will give you some of our data put together in terms of noticing trends. So when we think about the tactics that unions use, one way to think about those tactics is that they might be divided into three categories. So there could be, we can think about legal tactics, we can think about direct action tactics, and we can think about information gathering and distribution tactics. All of those are methods that unions use in order to get what they want or attempt to influence the political environment and get what they want. So today we are talking about one of those tactics, in particular strike. We are not talking about strike threats. We do not have in the databases tracking of strike threats. So just give you a quick definition, even though I'm sure we're all aware of what a strike is. But this is how we are defining strikes for the purpose of the presentation. So it's coercive tactics, collectively withholding labor, and it could include full or partial work stoppage, picket lines, and other service disruptions. All right, I will pass to Mimi.
Hello everyone, so I'll just talk a little bit about how I define K-12 strikes and some broad overview takeaways of what we did to find them. So we had to make the definition of strikes a little bit more precise for this context. I'm focusing just on public schools, and I define a teacher strike as a work stoppage that results in the closing of at least one school in a district, and I measure it at the school district level. And I say that because as you'll see, a lot of the strikes that happen are not legal, and sometimes the striking workers will will avoid using the term strike, but it still sort of fits my definition of strike. So as long as it's a teacher-driven work stoppage that results in the closure of at least one school in a district, I count it as a strike. So I worked with a team of researchers and an army of undergraduate researchers at Brown to develop this data set on teacher strikes. And very luckily, the folks at Cornell have now taken up the constant tracking of strikes, as I'm sure you guys are aware. So more recently, I'm able to update the data set using theirs. But I wanted to go back and create the data set starting in 2007, 2008. So in order to do that, I developed I got some administrative data from on all strikes that had taken place in Illinois and Pennsylvania. So I have the full census of strikes in those two states, and then I was able to use that information to develop a search procedure that I then trained undergraduates to do. We ended up reviewing about 90,000 news articles, and we found evidence of almost 800 teacher strikes over the past 16, 17 years. So the data set spans from the 2007-2008 school year to the present. And then we also, in the process of collecting these data, we came across a few other efforts that had pre-existing efforts at collecting information on teacher strikes, and so we're able to sort of cross-reference and update our data sets based on those, including the Cornell one, obviously. So I did 1 year overlap with the Cornell ILR tracker, and they're doing a great job. We should keep up their tracking. Okay. Higher ed strikes.
So we wanted for our data to be as analogous to the K-12 data as that was collected by Mimi. So even though some of our data was had a more expansive definition of strike, we decided to go for a more inclusive, a small definition of what a strike is, just so we can have more of a one-to-one comparison of strike. So as Mimi's definition, we define a strike as one where there is a stoppage by workers, which is during class hours and affects class operations. The reason we did this kind of definition is because there were several examples of service-based strikes. So for example, NYU had one last year where regarding the Palestine protest, they did a service strike where they withheld committee labor and other forms of administrative labor. Since that did not affect class operations or it didn't cause class to be disrupted in any way, we decided to exclude those. Additionally, there are other forms of labor that were excluded from this data set, even though we include them in the larger data set. So that includes undergraduate labor, building services labor, and food services labor. These are all the things that we track, but obviously if they go on strike, that does not affect class operations, so we decided to exclude them. So similar to how Mimi developed her database, we started this project in 2021, so to backtrack it, we used different databases and different collections of search strings on LexisNexis and Google to be able to develop that the database of strike activity. After that, we regularly updated it. So I took over that in 2022. So weekly Google search strings, looking for strikes and just updating like that. Cornell ILR has also been very helpful, so thank you to the folks over there. In addition, we also we did historic and now yearly FOIL requests to different state agencies, because different state agencies do require a notice to file for a strike to be submitted, or they require mediation to be done through the state. So that kind of gives us more data points to understand where strike activity occurs and where there's a potential for strike activity to occur. So now I'm going to hand it off to Jake for results, I think.
I didn't know we'd be doing this shuffle before we planned this. I could bring the mic down. Should we want to go on?
No, well, I want to be able to see the stuff. Okay, so so we wanted to show you guys a few just like broad trends in what we're finding with the strikes in K-12 and then in higher ed, and sort of think about them together so we can start to develop a way of thinking about them as a continuum. So first, just on K-12, and remember in K-12 we're talking about a lot more strikes. So this is showing both the number of strikes in red and the number of days on strike in blue across the academic school years that I'm including in my data set. And a couple of things stand out. Both is just like the sheer number of strikes in K-12 is going to be much higher than in higher ed, and it's a lot of strikes. And a lot of those strikes are happening in 2017, 2018 school year. That real surge, you can see, was a major outlier in terms of the number of teachers going on strike. And, but it's not totally unprecedented. So you can see that in 2014, 2015, there was also sort of a surge. But for the most part, we have about 14 teacher strikes per year. And after the big surge in 2017, 2018, there was another, 2018, 2019, still there are a number of teacher strikes that occurred that year, almost 200, but not anywhere near the over 300 teacher strikes of 2018, 2019. So we see this big surge, and then it seems to really slow down in terms of strike activity. On the other hand, in higher ed, we see more of an increase in more recent times, although in the most recent school year, you can see there does seem to be a little dip. So again, notice like the y-axis here is very different. We're talking about really like a much less common activity, but also there are going to be fewer institutions. There's tens of thousands, I don't know off the top of my head, schools in the United States, and depending on how to count them, 14,000 school districts in the United States. So we're talking about different scales, right? But you do see that there are a few surges, especially in more recent years. Though, again, like the surges are not as much of a surge as we saw in the K-12 2018 surge, where like the max number of strikes per year is 15 here in the higher ed, and the typical year is seeing about 6. So the surge in the 2023-2024 school year is not so atypical from what we are used to seeing in terms of higher ed strikes. And looking at them together, you again, I think like the major piece that jumps out to me is not just the difference in scale, we're just talking about a whole bunch more strikes in K-12, but also the fact that the higher ed strikes have more obviously increased in recent years, and that the K-12 strikes sort of died down after that surge in 2018, 2019.
So next we made a heat map of K-12 and higher ed data, because we were curious about where strikes were concentrated, and then that could kind of help us think through why that is the case. So on the left here, you can see the K-12 data, and this is a heat map. The darker the color, the more concentrated the amount of strikes are in that state over the time period we looked at. And the darkest color represents over 100 strikes happening in that state. So as we can see, Washington, Arizona, West Virginia, North Carolina are the states that we see the most strike activity with. Now when we look at the higher education, again, as Mimi noted, there's orders of magnitude less strikes happening in higher education. So the darkest color, being dark red, means that there are 13 to 16 strikes happening in that time frame. So as we can see here, New York, Illinois, Massachusetts, and California are the states that we really see the most amount of strike activity going on. When we see them side to side, we can kind of begin to see patterns, but also points of discontinuity. The West Coast, the Midwest, and the Northeast Coast are areas with high strike activity across both. But we're seeing that in K through 12. There are areas of the South, such as West Virginia, North Carolina, and Arizona, having high levels of strike activity that we aren't seeing in higher education.
So what we did here, this is about higher ed as a continuum, right? K through 12. So we tried to integrate our stuff here rather than treating them separate. We're just struggling with this minor logistical problem that we didn't foresee of having to run back and forth up here. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about strike durations. First, I do want to make one point that I don't remember if it was mentioned or not. Mimi's talked about how she was just looking in the public sector. We were looking with our higher ed data in the public and private sector. And so that's going to explain some of these differences you see. You see high New York strikes, right? That's in the private sector, right? Where the, Taylor law doesn't apply. So let's talk about strike durations. So how long are these strikes lasting? So we're going to do some descriptive stuff. This is the K through 12 data. Most strikes are very short little things. One day strike, bang, hey, just letting you know that we're here and this is what, we have some power and we're going to just close the district down for a day and then we're going to come back and negotiate. So the mode you can see is 1 day, and it's a huge mode in the sense that it's very likely that if there's going to be a strike, it's going to be a 1 day strike, right? Way more likely than any other strike duration. The average strike length in K through 12 is about 5 days, right? But this is skewed, we call it in statistics, it's skewed by a few number of high duration strikes that are going to pull that average up. So a lot of times it's better to look at the median, the duration that occurs in the middle, which is 2 days. So the median is 2 days. That tells us half of all strikes are 2 days or less, half of all strikes are 2 days or more. It's kind of a good little middle place to give us an idea of how long strikes last in K through 12. The majority of strikes end within 5 days, about 2/3, right? So that gives you some perspective. And most strikes, almost all strikes are less than 10 days long, right? 92% of strikes are less than 10-day strikes. The max is like, I can't read it on there, you can't read it either because it's tiny, but it's like 33 or 34 days, something like that, right? In this whole time period that you looked at, 34-day long strikes, okay? Now let's look at higher education. This is a funky looking graph. I compressed this a little bit. So what I did here, I'm zooming in on lower duration strikes because if I zoomed all the way out, you wouldn't even get to see any of this detail down here. So first I'm going to do this, then I'm going to zoom out, all right? So if we're looking at, it turns out one-day strike is the mode in higher education as well. You're more likely to have a one-day strike than anything. However, it is not much more likely than any of these other things like it is in K through 12. All right? It's actually not much more likely than a 2 or 3 day strike or a 4 day strike. Okay? These are all similarly likely to occur. The averages is higher, 20 days on average. Now again, this is a skewed thing because we do have some very, very long strikes. The longest one on our data set was a wildcat strike in Santa Cruz, where the graduate assistants withheld grades, which we said it was going to shut down operations in the school because they couldn't move on. 69% of strikes are less than 10 days. So we said in K through 12, 9 in 10 strikes are less than 10 days. Only 7 in 10 about are less than 10 days, right? Let me zoom in or zoom out now. You can see all the way out here. We have some over 200. Some's in the 100 days, right? So what I want to emphasize here is 11% of all strikes in higher ed are more than 40 days. All right? There was no strikes in K through 12 that were more than 40 days. So again, there's this general trend where we see strikes tend to last longer in higher education. There are some similarities, right? The one-day strike is still the most likely strike, but there are some differences. I also want to talk about, so this is a direct comparison here, and we can see like the spread is a little bit different, right? More stretched out, not as bunched near the bottom. I also want to talk about strike timing. When do strikes occur? During the academic year. We thought this would be something that's interesting to look at. We do see a trend, we do see something across the continuum here. Springtime is the strike time, all right? We do see a blip in February, but the two most common months that strikes occur in K through 12, April and May, in that order, right? April is the largest. And we find the same thing in higher education, right? April is the month that strikes are most likely to occur. May comes in second. We don't see that February blip. I'm not sure what's going on in K through 12 that is also a popular month. But so we can see it here when we look across these things, very similar, right? In terms of strategy, and we can talk about that and think about why that might be. Okay, back to Mimi.
And so we also wanted to conceptualize these in terms of legality. And so this map is showing where it's legal or illegal for public school K-12 teachers to strike. We think it's essentially the same for public sector higher ed. 37 states in the United States ban teacher strikes. A lot of times the prohibitions on teacher strikes were passed alongside collective bargaining rights. So the idea was like collective bargaining rights in exchange for labor peace. But I mean, as we all know, just banning strikes isn't really enough to actually get rid of strikes. So in K-12, strikes more often than not tend to be illegal. And this is just the state context. So I find almost 600, about 550 of the strikes that I find were in states where teacher strikes were illegal. And I think this is sort of a function of this idea that if you can mobilize a large enough group of people such that administering the consequences is impossible, then strike legality is sort of an afterthought or just not as big of a deterrent. Strike illegality is less of a deterrent. And you can see this makes sense, right? Even more so if we think about this, the light blue there is coordinated strikes. So this is multiple districts going on strike at the same time, whereas the red is individual district strikes. So both occur in both contexts, right? But you can see that when we're talking about illegal strikes, they're much more likely to be coordinated. And that again goes to this idea of Where often in these places that prohibit strikes, the penalty for striking is could be something like revoking teacher licenses and firing the teachers and putting the union leaders in jail. In a context like that, if you have all of the districts in the state, or if you have even a quarter of the districts in the state, it's going to be very unlikely that a penalty like that would actually be administered. Individual strikes are much more likely to be legal, and those are more of what we think about when we sort of conceptualize a typical strike, where they're occurring as part of stalled collective bargaining negotiations. In higher ed, we see reverse. So strikes are much more likely to take place in the legal context in higher ed. This is partially because so many of the strikes in higher ed are occurring in the private sector where strikes are protected. So the strikes legal is a combination of strikes in private sector universities and strikes in states that allow for public sector strikes. So strikes in public sector universities in states where it's not prohibited. But still, you can see that it's sort of the flip. So about 3/4 of the strikes in higher ed are occurring in a legal context. And just putting these together really emphasizes that dichotomy in terms of legality across the continuum.
Mimi, can I just interject? When we pull out private sector, it is still much more likely to be legal in higher ed. So that I want to make sure that it's clear that it's not that's not the only explanation, as that we're also looking at private sector.
So we also wanted to know what are the effects of strikes. And we're not just going to think about this in terms of what actually gets written into a contract, partially because a lot of the strikes in K-12 where we sort of develop this analysis are occurring outside of that traditional kind of scope of bargaining, where strikes are sometimes occurring in states like North Carolina where teacher collective bargaining is illegal. So we're not just going to look at the contracts. And I'm a public policy researcher. I was trained by a bunch of economists. So we're gonna look at what the actual economic outcomes are. So we're gonna use an applied econometric method called an event study analysis. And the benefit of this analysis is that we can fully recognize and account for the fact that places, entities, districts or even universities that have strikes are fundamentally different from entities that don't have strikes, for all sorts of reasons that may or may not be related to the strike itself. And so what we're going to do is take away essentially all of that variation and isolate the variation that is specifically related to the strike. And the way that we do that conceptually is by using the non-striking entities to develop a proxy trend for what we think would have happened in the striking entity had the strike not occurred. And then we use that proxy trend, so you can see we're going to take this proxy trend for what we think would have occurred based on what happened in the not striking places, and then we're going to apply that to our striking districts and estimate the effect of the strike as the difference between this proxy predicted trend and what actually happened. And functionally what we're doing is a fixed effects model where we have fixed effects at the entity level and at the year level. So we're taking away any variation that doesn't change over time within an institution, and we're also taking away any variation related to a specific year shock. And so the core assumption here is, essentially you're looking at it, is that the trends in the striking districts would have followed a similar trend to the non-striking districts had the strike not occurred. And you're going to be able to kind of gauge how much you buy that trend because we're going to show you the trends in advance too. If you're really up on your applied econometric literature, you'll know that there's been some evolutions in the thinking about this, and so we use a doubly robust estimator that isn't biased by the staggered treatment timing and heterogeneous treatment time. If that went a little whoosh, that's fine, no big deal. But my colleagues are going to discuss the results.
Thank you. That was a fantastic description of the approach that we used. I definitely couldn't explain it that well. Okay, what did we find? In K through 12, you can see, so what we did now is we're looking at all the
the schools, and we're averaging what we expect to find prior to a strike, 1 year prior, 2 years prior, 3 years prior, all the way out to 5 years prior to the strike, as well as 5 years after the strike. Doesn't matter when the strike occurred, all right? We're accounting for that, we're correcting that, okay? And we inflation adjusted this salary data. And so we wanted to see what are the effects of strikes on salaries, okay? Everybody's with that. K through 12, prior to strikes, right, at these schools, the salaries were stagnant. Inflation-adjusted change was non-existent, okay? Within this level of noise where we can say that there was nothing happening. After the strike, you can see a clear positive trend, right? The line going up means the salaries went up, right? So we say when we're 5 years out from a strike, right, after a strike, we can claim that there's a statistically significant effect. We're 99% sure, right, that this is true, that wages go up. How much they go up by? About $10,000 in 2018 dollars. All right? And this is full-time salaries is what we're looking at here. Okay? Now, oh yeah, go ahead.
A quick question on that. Excuse me. Is that only teacher salaries or like paraprofessional staff and other?
Only teachers, right?
Correct.
So that's one of the reasons Daniel said we limited our study to only instructors is because we're trying to make a comparison, right? So we only looked at instructors, faculties that specifically do instruction work. And so we're looking at full-time instructional faculty salaries as well to make an apples-to-apples comparison. So what did we see in higher ed? A little bit more complicated, okay? In higher ed, we actually saw a pre-trend. So what was happening is, in the years leading up to the strike, we did see inflation-adjusted salary growth, okay? However, we saw a discontinuity at the point of strike where there was an instantaneous change in the slope. The slope, if everybody can remember their freshman algebra, is how much it increases over time, right? Quadrupled, all right? So after a strike, the amount of inflation-adjusted salary increase in higher education quadruples, at least in the 5 years following the strike, okay? To about the same levels as we see in K through 12 in terms of the added benefit to the bang for your buck type of thing, okay? Actually, if you want to see them side by side. So very similar, except again, we saw a little bit of a pre-trend for higher education. We also looked at working conditions, which we defined as student-to-faculty ratios, and Daniel's going to tell us what we found here.
So we have access to the data of higher ed and K through 12. So in K through 12, it's people to teacher ratio. In higher ed, it's faculty to student ratio. And as Mimi and Jake explained, if we look at the pre-trend, we're not seeing a really strong pre-trend in K through 12. But then we're seeing in the post-trend, in the post-strike treatment group, we're seeing that after 3 years, there is about half a student per faculty, half a student per teacher decrease in the ratio. And that stays true up to 5 years after the strike. So that does suggest that 3 years after the strike until 5 years after the strike, there is a improvement in the faculty, the pupil to teacher ratio. So that kind of makes sense because in the K through 12 context, this is something that they're often directly collectively bargaining about or they're directly striking about. They want to improve the ratio because that is something that is directly affecting them. In the higher ed, it's a little bit more complicated, right? We're seeing a lot of noise. We're not seeing a clear trend in the pre-treatment group, and the post-treatment group, we're not really seeing a really clear trend either. It's kind of oscillating around 0. It kind of jumps up around 5. So it doesn't seem like there is a clear effect on the faculty to student ratio for higher education. And when you see them next to each other, our take-home message here is really that K through 12 has a tangible benefit based on this analysis of half a student per teacher, but higher education, we're really not seeing a specific benefit. Now, what are the specific key takeaways? And Rhiannon will begin to that.
All right, so I'll give you just a brief review of sort of what we've learned from this data so far, and then I think what we'll do is we're going to do a little turn and talk, and you can chat with people close to you, and then we'll have a full group discussion, and we also encourage audience members to really be part of that discussion rather than just asking questions necessarily. So overall, we have seen that there has been a recent increase in the number of strikes. This applies to both K-12 and higher education. This was particularly the case around 2017 to 2018. We have also seen that strikes are usually less than 10 days long. This is the case both in K-12 and higher education, but we are seeing a willingness to strike for longer periods of time in higher ed. February to May tends to be the hot time for strikes, and in K-12 we're also seeing some tendency to strike in September and October. There's also similarities in where the strikes are taking place. So the hot spots for strikes seem to be the West Coast, the Atlantic Northeast, and the northern states in the Midwest. However, we did see that blip in 2018, 2019 with the Red for Ed strikes. So that was, that was interesting. And we're also seeing an increased willingness to strike even when it's illegal. When we look at this over the past, especially if we consider this over the past, 30 to 40 years perhaps. And in higher ed, around half of the strikes have been illegal. And we see in K-12 that there's very high numbers of illegal strikes, especially when they're coordinated strikes. And that's something we really saw in the Red for Ed strikes, where entire states of teachers went on strike. So we wonder what all of this means for the laws that are restricting public sector strikes. We're wondering if there will be more concerted efforts by labor to target or dismantle the laws that are restricting strikes. And we're also wondering what the shifts in the White House will mean for such laws. And we also would like to draw attention to precarity in education work. We believe that it's not coincidence that we are seeing increased precarity in education work alongside increased willingness to strike. I think, in terms of context, as we all know, instructional work is being outsourced, and that applies at both the K-12 level as well as higher ed level. In K-12, we see, nonprofits taking over functions that used to be performed by teachers or people employed by the district. And we're also seeing, of course, contingents in grad workers, increasingly used as a method for cost cutting in higher education. And teachers' work is underpaid, and I think this is something that people in K-12, are very aware of, and I think it is also something that, especially in sort of the public universities and public colleges, workers also feel that very much the case. So overall, we are seeing increased willingness to strike amongst those with enhanced precarity in their jobs. So we would like to sort of leave you with a couple of questions to consider, and I ask you to go into groups of 3 to 4. I'm a teacher, so bear with me here. We ask for you to go into groups of 3 to 4, so not just the person next to you, but maybe try to get a few different people together and to consider a few questions that we pose to you, but also if you have questions that came up for you during the presentation, this is a great time to chat. Maybe we'll give you about 5 minutes or so to talk. So here are our questions for you. So we do wonder, one of the things we are wondering about is collaboration. We are seeing from the data that striking does seem to reap at least some degree of results. And so we're wondering, are there opportunities for collaboration? And this question extends across 2 domains. So one is collaboration between management and unions. You know, there have been cases, I think Jake has a piece published that talks about even back as early as 1912, the president of Bryn Mawr College spoke about how she supported the strike because it was the only way to actually increase funding for higher ed. So we see shared interest here, and we're wondering, you know, are there opportunities for collaboration? What would that look like or not look like? What are the concerns? What's coming up for you? And then the second area is K-12 and higher education. Are there opportunities for collaboration there with regard to strikes? And then secondly, when illegality is sort of the hot button, and I'm looking at you, Brett Benjamin, but there's a lot of talk in my own union, which is UUP, around the Taylor Law and the restrictions of the Taylor Law on our ability to strike within the union, and I know this is the case for many other unions as well. So how do we deal with illegality, and does this shape the kind of work that we do in our collective bargaining or the tactics that we take up? So again, turn and talk, 3 to 4 people. We'll give you 5 minutes, and then we'll come back as a group to have a full conversation. Thank you.
So on the record, what do you think about strikes?
Please don't make my job that hard. Don't do that to me.
That's right, there you go. So you just give him the word. That'd be like decades of job security.
It's funny. I was at Fredonia a few weeks ago at a general membership meeting. I only talked for a couple minutes. This member raises her hand and she goes, "Are we involved in all these talks about a general strike?" And Matt jumped out of his chair. Matt Kibler, it was like he had a firecracker lit under his chin. No, Matt Kibler.
I would be like, let's go.
No, but Matt was like,
He's always engaging in action. Like he knows.
but Matt Kibler was like, "Let me tell you what they did to Buffalo when they had us sick out."
Exactly.
So he was just like, "But that's his job." And I'm like, "Matt, that is your job to let people know what the stakes are." And I just said, it is deeply unlikely that right now we would actually make that law as your union. So know that. But you all are individual agents. You can choose to disobey if you choose to. I mean, I said that and Matt was clearly uncomfortable. But
That was like, I repeat, we do not condone strikes.
he was like, "Here's what they did to the teachers at Illinois. They fired them all. They took away their dues deduction." So yeah, but it was like that guy moved fast when that happened.
There's another part of that though, which is that even without striking, the call is for contract alignment. And so it's not inconceivable to me that might factor into our considerations about contract. That, 2020 is really kind of in alignment with whether we're striking or not, remains a way for us to position ourselves in a broader way.
That was really nice to see so many vibrant conversations happening, and I think as a group we are very interested to hear. We are interested to hear questions from you on our data. We're interested in hearing critiques of the data as well. We are interested in hearing your thoughts in relation to some of the questions we've raised. We do ask that you keep your comments brief, please, and speak into the microphone so that can be captured by by everybody in the room, so it's accessible. So keep your comments brief, but please do feel free to also make comments. But perhaps we'll open
And
with
questions.
yeah.
If you want questions.
Yeah. Perhaps we'll open with a question first, and then we can sort of dive off from there. Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering if you have put any thought into the correlation of outcomes of strikes with the economic situation in the country at the time. So like state COLAs or state per pupil funding, things like that, overlaying those. Yeah, or benefits costs.
What we're doing is estimating it relative to like other districts in the same time period. So this would be essentially in and above any like broad national trends. With the exception that if like strikes tended to happen in places, like if strikes tended to happen at specific time periods in places where cost of living was already going up, if that were the case, then we would expect to see that happening in the pre-period also. We did like do quite a bit of digging to try to understand what was going on, and I think some of the there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of what is actually happening on the ground. But I think a really important thing with the K-12 strikes is that, and an explanation for why they're so short, is that part of what they're doing is signaling to the public the need for change in education. So a lot of times I don't think that this is going to be, and we know just from like reading contracts where we could see them, and that it's not necessarily just that there's a wage increase that's getting negotiated in the contract. It's also that, especially with these coordinated strikes where multiple districts are going on strike all at the same time, there's also an increase in the way that political actors are talking about education and how often political actors are talking about education. And so the idea here is that strikes are not just these, like teacher strikes at least, are not just these like simple one-to-one bargaining table negotiations, but they're also signaling to the public that there's problems that need to change. So I have a paper that's out, this was actually the first paper to come out of the strike project, that estimates the effect of teacher strikes on political ads that mention education. And there's like, which we look at the month level, so we can like see a little bit, whereas this is at the year level, because salaries only change every, but, and we see a dramatic like 400% increase in the chance that a political actor mentions education in their ad, in a campaign ad, as a result of the strike. So I think that, like the intuition that there's broader stuff going on is right. And what we're doing is estimating that broader stuff that is like directly or indirectly downstream caused by the strike. And it's a combination of both of those things happening.
Thank you. Takes a village. Two database questions, which may or may not be connected. You have strikes as a single event, right? Do you also have data on number of striking workers per event? And second question, do you have anything in your data set around strike funds and whether that increases A, willingness, B, duration, or C, outcome?
Excellent questions and stuff that we can look into. No, we did. For the higher ed stuff, we don't have any data on strike funds, and we did not. Did we control for enrollment? Actually, we did control. We controlled for the enrollment of the college or university, and that can be kind of a proxy of the number of workers on strike. It's not perfect, but we could actually use that if we wanted to. The problem with that is, I guess what I would do is I would use iPad data and see the number of full-time instructors. Well, that's the problem though, because some of them involve multiple things. So it's a matter of constructing that. I don't know the best way to do it, because we do have numbers of workers on strike. They come from news sources, and a lot of times they're conflicting. And what the union says is number on strike is different than what the university says is a number on strike. So it gets complicated. So we just kind of avoided that by doing an indirect proxy. But that is something that we could at least explore and see if that makes a difference if we measure it different ways and things like that. But the strike fund one is a good one as well.
In K-12, it's sort of similar. We don't ever observe like an exact number of the workers on strike, because a lot of times the data is coming from press releases or just saying school is canceled. And so then I can go and figure out how many teachers are in that district. When I do that, I do see that the effects are larger in bigger districts. but that could be a function of a lot of different things.
So I come from a state where it's illegal to strike, so one of the things we've been considering doing is work to rule. I was wondering if you have any data about that and whether, how successful that is generally. I'm a graduate assistant, so we're technically part-time workers and we're obviously doing way more work than that, but I wonder if in full-time it's, if it's less popular.
So I would love to have a better measure of strike threat. I think of work to rule as an escalation tactic, and it's just really hard to collect information on that because, like I said, at least in K-12, the information is coming largely from schools getting shut down. So that's how this was possible, is because when schools are closed, there has to be some local media that's telling parents, school is closed, don't send your kid. So we were always usually able to find something, and then once we knew something, then we could figure out stuff about the strike. But with work to rule or any other escalation tactic, then the whole, the district has no interest in telling parents hey, your teachers might not be doing a great job grading their papers this semester, I do try to get at strike threats in a few different ways to try to see okay, well, what about if we look at districts that are close by, because those strike threats might increase more, the credibility of the strike threat might increase more, and that goes in the direction that you'd expect. So where if we sort of remove the close by districts, the effect relative to the control districts gets even larger, sort of implying that there is some sort of spillover strike effect into neighboring districts where you could think about that as just competing for the same workforce, or you could also think about it as potentially increasing the credibility of the strike threat in neighboring districts.
Something to add is that in addition to strike escalation tactics and we collect strike threat data as well compared to Mimi's data, which only focuses on strikes. But something that we've noticed is that it's very hard to collect very reliable strike threat data because we're kind of limited to press, as it's been mentioned earlier, press releases and stuff like that. So we've noticed that it's very hard to get a strike threat from a very small college, right? Because it might not be reported in local media, but we might be able to dig up an Instagram post from the union posting it to however many followers they have or something, right? But so it's very hard to develop a very consistent methodology to be able to get data that we know is representative of the population as much as we can. So I think that kind of also applies to work to rule. Because they could make a strike threat or work to rule threat privately. They could be doing it privately. There's really no way for us to know about it or track it.
That said, just building on that anecdotally, because we haven't done a full analysis, but we're tracking strike threats to see is this going to turn into a strike and add it into this thing. And oh no, there's a vote to strike, and now they have a contract. So we see that a lot, right? Where strikes don't materialize in higher ed. When we're following what's going on because, these things are also doing something.
Hello, my name is Manny. I'm with SEIU Local 99 in Los Angeles, California. I just want to say I think it's a missed opportunity that non-teacher education worker strikes were not tracked. As far as the number of people that are on strike, I think that needs to be tracked as well, and knowing how many people are in that bargaining unit. You don't have to necessarily assume the number of teachers, but the number of people in that bargaining unit that's going on strike can get you that number. And also the tracking of the actual schools that are going on strike. We represent classified employees in LA Unified. We had the biggest education worker strike in the history of this country. We had 60,000 workers on the streets for 3 days. There's over 1,000 school sites in LA Unified. And And so classified employees, it was a classified employee worker strike. We had the teachers join us in a solidarity strike, which added to the numbers. Yeah, so I think it's a missed opportunity not to have this data, and I'm wondering like what this data would have looked like if that would have been taken into account.
So, excellent point. For the higher ed stuff, we are tracking non-instructional stuff. We're tracking all higher ed strikes, any type of employees. Just for the analysis we presented today, we didn't include it, but we do have that data. In terms of like the number of people on strike, we said it's a complicated thing, and then you can go to databases to try to find how many titles qualify, but a lot of these, it's not as clear cut in some of these databases. You have to kind of make some assumptions, and sometimes you can't parse out certain titles compared to other titles. So it's a little bit complicated. We can do our best to kind of approximate those things. And we probably will going forward, but it's not as easy. I do want to just make that point. Oh yeah, sorry.
In K-12, I totally agree that someone should be also tracking other types of strikes. I've noticed just in the tracking of teacher strikes that bus driver strikes seem to really be increasing, and I'm really fascinated by this. And the Cornell ILR tracker certainly makes that easier. So basically they're tracking all strikes and labor actions that are happening, and then you can sort of sort and filter, and their database is exceptional. So these kinds of things are much more possible now with Cornell's tracking. It's as of 2021. And what I've noticed also is that, so part of why we could not track non-teacher strikes is that oftentimes the non-teacher strikes don't shut down school. And so we could never be confident. We were not confident that we were actually capturing all of them. And that's something I've noticed with the bus driver strikes too, which really surprised me, because I thought like, or even cafeteria worker strikes too. They're not shutting down school for those strikes. And, or only in very rare situations are they shutting down school. And the LA strike where teachers did the solidarity strike, that does count as a teacher strike in my data set, because the teachers, if I'm remembering correctly, but tell me if I'm wrong, is that that's when school was canceled, is when the teachers decided to join the strike.
No. It's actually, because the classified workers are the ones that provide special ed work, they're the ones that drive the buses, they're the ones that open the schools, right, the custodians and so forth. So the teachers had a strike back in, I want to say, 2018 in LA Unified. And when they went on strike, the school stayed open because they put all of the kids in the auditorium, and they just needed a certificate in person to be there with them, and that was the principal, right? And so it wasn't until classified employees went on strike that the schools were shut down. So it's interesting that you say that classified employees don't necessarily shut down the schools, because especially with things that are mandated by law, special education, food, like, things like that, that's where you have to shut down. If not, you're going to have,
you could have a lawsuit.
Yeah, definitely, and you're going to have the parents just swarming the school, pounding their fists. And another thing I also wanted to, one of the things that I think was interesting in our strike was that we inspired other labor unions to go on strike that summer. So yeah, we went on strike in March, right? And then they called it a hot labor summer in LA, where SAG-AFTRA went on strike, Teamsters went on strike. It was just it seemed like every week a new union was going on strike in LA. And so I don't know how that can be tracked, because I know that can be challenging, but just what was pointed out earlier, 1/3 of labor or organized labor is education worker, right? And that shows right there the power that we have, not only to go on strike, but to inspire other unions to also go on strike.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Thanks. Hi, Jeff Staten, Emory University of Atlanta. One question, one thought. So the question is, what are the other outcomes that you've been looking at that might be the potential effects of strikes? I can think of several economic ones. We're just wondering if you've thought about kind of attitudinal relationship type measures between folks in the higher ed community. That's one. The idea is about an instrument for your strike. Seems like it's in your data, possibly, right? So like the time, basically just the count of days prior to finals. Seems like it's going to be a really strong predictor of whether you have a strike, and trying to think through ways in which it would affect salary or anything else aside from through the way it might affect the strike. Seems like a plausible instrument, and I'm not sure if anyone in your literature has looked at that, but that's what your presentation sparked in me. So thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. Pass it.
Hi, Patrick Cleo at AFL-CIO, and actually just on the strike fund question that came up, I did want to do a quick plug to the AFL-CIO strike map, which we work with the Cornell on their tracker, and it's a subset of that. It's not everything that Cornell has, because it's also strikes that our affiliate unions ask us to put up. So it's a smaller universe, but it includes strike funds.
Gary Rhodes, I'm a member of United Campus Workers Arizona, Local 7065, the CWA, which is a wall-to-wall, non-collective bargaining, but we include all employees, staff, students, faculty of all types. Just first, I applaud you doing this work. I know this is a lot of work, gathers a lot of data, it's really important. What I want to encourage is, and it follows up on something Jake said in an earlier session, about the combination of quantitative and qualitative. And the comments here up in front, is you also commented in the CFA section, is it Manny?
Yes.
Yeah, so the common cause, kind of speaking to your first question about a cross-sector support. So you were supportive of CFA, they were supportive of you. Our conversation here at Harvard is we need to even increase support among, like at Harvard, custodial workers union and clerical workers. So one thing to think about, and I think your comment about like the effect of one group going out affects others, is to think geographically in addition to the national data that you're gathering. Concentrate on something like Chicago, like LA, where there is trigger effects and catalyzing effects of one group going out. And encourage other people to join you in a project that does precisely that. I'm not saying you should do it, you're already super tasked and have a lot of work to do, but I think that'd be a great thing for the center to do. How to build solidarity and build a sense of possibility about we can close this place down. And I mean this place, the city, not just a school, not just a district, not just a college, not just a university. And the other comment on the qualitative lines is, I know in higher ed, when the scale is so massive at the schools level, it's harder to do, but in higher ed, the scale is such, like when I'm tracking what are the wins of grad student unions, obviously wages and benefits matter, but just as obviously when I go to their websites and the scale is small enough, I can just go to all the websites, it's also independent external arbitration on sexual harassment. That's why they're striking. It's not just for money. And so any local is going to put up, here's our wins. And so not you to do it, but as you kind of coordinate the center collecting more research on the effectiveness, we know they work, that's why they try to outlaw them. Right? It's like the question of, do unions contribute to a wage increase? Of course they do, that's why they're fighting against having unions. But just kind of combining the great quantitative work you're doing and refining it here and there, but then seeing if you can list some other folks to do some geographical city-focused or metro-focused sort of stuff. And also just ask the union leader, what are the wins? What are they posting as wins?
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll leave. And on that note, I think one thing that I've noticed is it's different how people articulate the wins depending upon who you ask, right? So if you're asking grad workers, so for example, I interviewed a range of people, because I'm a qualitative researcher, a range of people for the Rutgers strike, and the grad workers spoke really differently about the Rutgers strike than, the official, person from the union about what those wins were and what the gaps were. So I think, I agree with you, Gary, that we can get more robust data by filling in those gaps with qualitatives. Thank you.
Just really quickly, I would be remiss if I didn't take the chance to jump off of those comments and mention the call to a general strike in 2028, and really thinking about not just cross union within our own sector, but across all sectors, and what is possible there.
Thank you. Okay, are there any other comments or questions that are not submitted? Okay.
I got a comment. One of our findings was in K through 12, we actually see the teacher to faculty ratio significantly decrease 5 years after the strike. And it's noisy in higher ed, right? We don't necessarily see that. However, one criticism that I've heard is after a strike, all right, you get your raises, right? It's a zero-sum game, right? Speaking to what we heard this morning. And because you got your raises, we're laying off some adjuncts. And because of that, class sizes are getting bigger, right? And that's just that's the way it works, right? What we can tell you is that in higher ed, that's not the way it works. We can't say that it reduces class size, but we can definitively say that it does not increase class sizes in the strike. So I do want to just emphasize and drive that point.
On the other outcomes, I've looked at like a bunch of other outcomes because there's pretty good data on local public school districts. I have an NBR working paper, Causes and Consequences of Teacher Strikes. I think there's like 18 outcomes I look at in that paper. None are attitudinal measures, but I have a different paper that does look at attitudinal measures. And what we find, it's on like political behavioral effects of strikes. So just a quick bit on that is that we found that if you look just immediately after the strike, strikes do increase overall public support for increasing education spending. If you look long run and you allow for that effect to pan out, it ultimately strikes decrease support for increasing education spending amongst Republican voters, and also strikes decrease turnout in elections for Republican voters. And we think that this has to do with like a political efficacy kind of mechanism where because strikes are resulting in these salary wins, they sort of demobilize Republican voters who may have been opposed to increasing teacher salaries, and then increase that feeling of education spending has gone too high.
Well,
Just
that
little
sounds like a
plugs for
win.
other stuff. What do you say?
I said that sounds like a win-win.
But that's in the working paper, also on the Annenberg working paper series.
To your point, the higher ed database does track the tentative contract that does come out of a strike or a strike threat. The issue, as Brandon mentioned, is that we don't know how much, when they say we got a $10,000 raise and we got a mandatory arbitration for sexual harassment clause, we don't know how much of that was negotiated before the strike, and then how much that strike added that extra little bit. So that is something, but we are collecting that data for on a qualitative level, just to kind of understand what strikes and strike threats and their ramifications are.
Well, one more. Okay. All right, I'll be back.
Thank you. Brendan Cunningham, CSU AUP. I'm my organization's treasurer, so of course I think about financial reports, and the IRS 990s might have bargaining units asset pool, which I don't know if that's the data you use, but that's all public until the IRS goes away. The question I have is related to the strikes among the privates. Because I tend to think of them as advocacy chapters because of yeshiva, at least among like the permanent faculty. So are those strikes in your data set primarily graduate students, or is it also the advocacy chapters?
Both.
It's both.
I don't know, Nick, did you want?
Like what portion, like?
Oh, good question. Where's my laptop? Not here. I can talk to you afterward about it. Okay, I'll tell you.
All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it.